Flight attendant refuses a seat to a school teacher, not knowing he owns the airline. As the plane cruised smoothly at 300 feet, the soft chime of the intercom cut through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge a special passenger on board. Mr. Daniel Cooper, the owner of our airline, is traveling with us today." The first-class cabin fell into a stunned silence. Laura, the flight attendant who had dismissed Daniel to economy, felt the blood drain from her face. Her perfect smile cracked, her grip on the drink tray trembling. She turned slowly, her eyes locking onto Daniel, who sat calmly in the cramped economy seat, surrounded by wide-eyed passengers. Daniel rose slowly, the entire plane watching as he walked down the aisle. He paused beside Laura, his voice gentle but firm. "You told me I didn't belong in first class," he said. "Maybe now you'll think twice before judging someone by their appearance." Passengers erupted into applause. Laura's polished demeanor shattered as she whispered a quiet, "I'm so sorry." But Daniel had already turned away, his quiet strength speaking louder than any reprimand could. Thank you and call to action. If this story moved you, hit the like button, drop a 1 in the comments, and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire and challenge perspectives. Your support helps us keep sharing powerful tales of truth and justice, because everyone deserves a seat where they belong. The morning rush at New York's JFK International Airport was a symphony of controlled chaos. The terminal buzzed with the rhythmic hum of rolling suitcases, hurried footsteps, and muffled announcements over the intercom. Neon-lit signs directed streams of travelers through winding security lines, while flight status boards flickered with destinations. From Paris, gate attendants managed queues with practiced efficiency, their voices cutting through the clamor, guiding passengers with swift hand motions. Nearby, families huddled around phone chargers, business people tapped away on laptops, and tired tourists cradled cups of coffee as if they held the last drops of energy. The scent of pretzels and fresh coffee drifted from kiosks, mingling with the crisp, conditioned air. Underneath the polished floors and glass ceilings, a sense of anticipation and movement pulsed through every corridor, each traveler part of a larger story unfolding one flight at a time. Amid the bustling crowd stood Daniel Cooper, a man whose calm presence seemed to part the sea of hurried travelers. In his early 40s, Daniel wore his modesty as naturally as his well-worn leather jacket. His jeans, comfortable and slightly faded, brushed over sturdy boots that had clearly seen more sidewalks than red carpets. He moved with an easy, unhurried stride, his steps measured and purposeful. His brown eyes held a quiet warmth, framed by the gentle creases of a life lived with integrity and hard-earned wisdom. There was nothing ostentatious about him. No designer labels, no glint of expensive accessories. Just a well-used backpack slung over one shoulder and a paperback novel tucked under his arm. Yet there was something magnetic about Daniel. Perhaps it was his posture, straight but not rigid, or the subtle way he made space for others without a second thought. He helped a young mother lift her stroller over a curb, his touch light but assured. He nodded kindly to an elderly man struggling with his suitcase, offering a hand that was accepted with relief. His every action spoke of a man who saw others, who valued the small, often overlooked moments of kindness. As he approached the gate for his first-class boarding, he offered his ticket with a soft smile, ready to enjoy the rare treat of a little comfort on his journey. But beneath that calm surface, there was a strength that hinted at deeper layers. A storm waiting in the wings, if needed. Laura Bennett was everything the airline wanted in a senior flight attendant. With her perfectly pressed uniform and polished demeanor, she moved through the terminal like a ship's captain on a calm sea. Her dark blonde hair was pulled into a neat twist, and her makeup was pristine, a subtle blush, a hint of lipstick, and eyes that missed nothing. She had been with the airline for over a decade, climbing the ranks through a blend of discipline and a knack for reading people. Her voice, when addressing passengers, was a practiced melody of warmth and authority. She could soothe a crying child or quiet a disgruntled traveler with the same measured smile. But beneath that professional exterior, Laura held fast to her judgments. She believed in order, in clear distinctions between those who belonged and those who did not. Her eyes scanned the boarding line, categorizing passengers with practiced efficiency. The business travelers with their tailored suits and leather briefcases? First class, no question. The family with toddlers and juice-stained clothes? Ennemi, undoubtedly. When she saw Daniel, her smile tightened ever so slightly. His casual attire and the well-loved book in his hand clashed with her mental image of a premium passenger. She saw the worn edges of his jacket, the scuffs on his boots, and her decision was made long before he reached the front of the line. When Daniel handed over his ticket, Laura's eyes flicked to the first-class stamp and then back to his face. Her expression remained polite, but the edge in her tone sharpened. "Sir, I believe you may be in the wrong line. First class is for premium passengers only." Her words hung in the air, cool and dismissive, a line drawn firmly in the sand. She was the gatekeeper, and Daniel, in her eyes, was knocking at a door that wasn't meant for him. But what Laura couldn't see, what her practiced eyes missed entirely, was that this door was not hers to guard. Not today. "Sir, I believe you may be in the wrong line. First class is for premium passengers only." Laura Bennett's voice, perfectly modulated and just polite enough, cut through the general hum of the boarding area. She stood in front of Daniel Cooper, her posture unwavering, one manicured hand held out as if to physically prevent him from stepping any further. Her smile, the kind designed to disarm complaints, only accentuated the edge in her tone. Daniel blinked, his expression as calm as ever. He reached into his worn leather jacket, pulling out the neatly folded boarding pass. "My ticket says first class," he said, his voice steady. He handed it to her, his movements slow and deliberate. There was no trace of defensiveness, only a quiet patience, as if he had walked this road before. Laura accepted the ticket, her practiced smile faltering for a split second as her eyes darted over the print. She glanced up at him again, a flicker of disbelief in her gaze. "Are you sure this wasn't issued by mistake?" she pressed. "Perhaps someone else purchased it for you?" Daniel's jaw tightened, but he held her gaze. "I bought it myself," he replied simply. A few passengers shifted in their seats, the tension curling through the air like smoke. A businessman in a crisp suit glanced over his newspaper, his brow furrowing before he returned to his reading, pretending not to listen. A young woman with earbuds half in pulled one out, curiosity drawing her attention. A couple a few rows back exchanged looks, their conversation pausing mid-sentence. It was the kind of scene where everyone noticed, but no one interfered. Eyes sliding away, ears straining to catch every word without appearing to. Laura's lips pressed into a thin line. "I need to verify this," she said, her voice carrying that careful mix of authority and condescension. "Please, step aside." Daniel hesitated, a beat of stillness before he nodded. He moved to the side, his posture unchanged. Around him, the normal rhythms of boarding continued, but with a subtle shift, like a melody gone slightly off-key. Inside, Daniel's thoughts moved like a steady river beneath a frozen surface. He had seen this before, felt the weight of judgment and quiet dismissal. He knew how quickly appearances could lead to conclusions, how often assumptions stepped ahead of truth. His pulse remained even, his breathing measured, but beneath it all something stirred. It wasn't anger. It was a quiet, resilient kind of resolve, a sense that this moment, as small as it seemed, was part of something larger. He could feel the eyes on him, the unspoken questions, the unvoiced judgments. But he also felt the familiar strength of his own patience. He stood there, waiting, his calm demeanor a choice, a deliberate decision not to react but to observe, to allow the truth to unfold on its own. Because Daniel Cooper knew something Laura Bennett did not. The truth, when it came, would not need his help to make itself known. and he, with all the quiet dignity he carried, was more than prepared to wait. Daniel moved down the narrow aisle of the plane, his first-class ticket now a crumpled reminder in his hand. The journey to the back of the aircraft felt longer than it was, each step drawing more eyes, each glance a quiet judgment. He found an empty seat near the rear, the cramped space a stark contrast to the comfort he had paid for. As he adjusted his bag under the seat, a soft sound drew his attention. A mother struggling with an overflowing diaper bag and a toddler twisting in her arm. Without hesitation, Daniel stood, his movements unhurried. "Here, let me help you," he said gently. He reached for the bag, his grip steady, guiding it into the overhead compartment. The mother's face flushed with relief. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice taut with the exhaustion of travel and small children. Daniel just nodded, offering her a kind smile before returning to his seat. The quiet kindness of the act drew a few subtle looks, but the plane settled back into its pre-flight rhythm, the moment swallowed by the broader hum of anticipation. Up in first class, Laura moved with a practiced grace, her demeanor a study in contrasts. She flowed through the cabin, offering drinks and folding blankets, her smile warm and genuine with the right kind of passengers. She leaned in close to the businessman in 2A, laughing at his joke, her hand resting lightly on the back of his seat. She exchanged pleasant small talk with the couple in 3C and 3D, recommending the in-flight menu with a conspiratorial wink. To them, she was the epitome of hospitality. Attentive, charming, a perfect reflection of the airline's premium service. But beneath that polished exterior, a different Laura simmered. When a young woman in 4B asked for a blanket, Laura's smile tightened, the edges sharpening. Her tone shifted, just a shade cooler, as she handed over the folded fabric. When a man in 1C, his accent thick with the Middle East, requested water, her response was clipped, the glass placed on his tray table without the warmth she had shown others. The duality in her behavior was subtle, almost imperceptible to those wrapped in their own bubbles. But for anyone paying attention, it was clear. Laura's hospitality had boundaries, and not everyone was welcome within them. She moved through the cabin, her practiced charm faltering in small, telling ways. Her eyes darted to the economy cabin now and then, a flicker of annoyance passing over her features. The earlier encounter with Daniel lingered in her mind, a stubborn wrinkle in the smooth fabric of her day. She couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong, but her certainty, her unshakable belief in her own judgment, kept her from seeing it. In her world, people fit into neat categories, and Daniel Cooper had not matched the mold. What she didn't realize as she handed a glass of champagne to the impeccably dressed woman in 2B was that the real turbulence had nothing to do with the sky. It was building around her, quietly, inevitably, a storm waiting to break. Captain Thomas Grant sat in the cockpit, his hands resting lightly on the controls as the plane ascended smoothly into the sky. His co-pilot managed the technical chatter with air traffic control, but Captain Grant's mind was elsewhere. The quiet chime of a message on his in-flight communication screen had pulled his attention away from the usual routines. The message bore a name he recognized instantly. Daniel Cooper. It wasn't just familiarity. It was the kind of name every senior employee at the airline knew, not just from memos, but from the foundational stories of the company itself. Grant's brow furrowed slightly as he reviewed the passenger manifest. Daniel Cooper was listed in first class, a priority status attached to his booking. He tapped through a few screens, a gnawing sense of unease building in his gut. It wasn't just the name. It was a gut instinct, a whisper in his mind that something wasn't right. He toggled over to the cabin camera feed, a quiet protocol he used when his instincts needed confirmation. On the screen, he saw Laura Bennett moving through the first-class cabin, her demeanor polished and poised. But there was a tightness to her movements, a subtle stiffness in her gestures, as if a string had been pulled too taut. Her smile came and went like a light switch, warm and genuine for some, cool and transactional for others. She handed drinks to one passenger, adjusted a blanket for another, but her expression faltered whenever her gaze drifted toward the back of the plane. The discrepancy was small but unmistakable, a shadow at the edge of her polished professionalism. Meanwhile, in the cramped seat of economy, Daniel Cooper sat with his phone balanced on his knee. He typed a short message, his thumb moving deliberately across the screen. Boarded, moved to economy, ticket not checked properly. He hit send and leaned back, slipping the phone into his jacket pocket. His face remained placid, his demeanor unchanged, but the message was a quiet stone dropped into still waters. He wasn't sending a complaint, he was sending a signal, a quiet ripple that would soon reach shores unseen. As he looked out the small window, his expression remained calm, but beneath it the current of his thoughts moved steadily forward. Daniel knew patience was a powerful tool, especially when wielded against those who mistook it for passivity. His message wasn't just a notification, it was the first step in letting the truth unfold, and he, more than anyone, understood that truth often arrived in whispers before it thundered. As the plane cruised steadily above the clouds, Daniel's gaze remained fixed on the patchwork of earth below. His reflection in the window stared back at him, and with it came a flood of memories. Moments etched into his life, like stubborn ink stains. Years ago, Daniel had been a young, enthusiastic teacher at a public high school in Atlanta. Fresh out of graduate school, he had dreams of creating change, of being the kind of teacher who not only taught history, but helped write it. But it didn't take long for the shadows of prejudice to creep in. Despite his qualifications and the respect he earned from students, Daniel often found himself overlooked when it came to leadership roles. He remembered the faculty meetings where his ideas were politely noted but never implemented, the promotions that always seemed to go to less experienced colleagues with lighter skin and louder voices. He had taught students about civil rights, about standing up against injustice, all the while swallowing the bitter pill of his own reality. The final straw had been a parent-teacher conference where a father had openly questioned if Daniel was qualified enough to teach advanced placement courses. His principal had stood beside him, smiling uncomfortably, offering no support. Instead of growing bitter, Daniel chose a different path. He left the school system and started an education consulting business, helping underfunded schools find resources and training. His patience, the kind that bore roots in pain and hope alike, became his greatest strength. He grew his business with integrity, and when the opportunity came, he invested in an airline startup led by a group of like-minded visionaries. That startup eventually became one of the country's leading airlines, with Daniel Cooper quietly stepping into the role of majority owner. The patience he showed now in the cramped economy seat was not born of passivity. It was the same patience that had built his career, the same patience that turned silent suffering into quiet power. He knew the sting of being judged by appearance alone, and he had learned long ago that true strength lay in choosing when to speak and when to wait. In the quiet hum of the cockpit, Captain Grant's communication screen pinged again. This time the message was marked urgent, its sender high up in the airline's corporate ladder. He tapped the screen, and a name appeared that sent a ripple through his calm exterior. Daniel Cooper. His eyes widened, the weight of recognition settling into his chest. Cooper wasn't just any passenger. He was the owner of the airline. His fingers moved quickly, pulling up the cabin manifest. There it was, clear as day. Daniel Cooper, first class, seat 2A. Yet a quick glance at the cabin feed showed the seat empty. Laura Bennett moving past it with her polished efficiency. His voice remained steady as he picked up the in-flight phone, but beneath it the current of urgency ran deep. "Laura," he spoke into the receiver, his tone firm but even. "I need to confirm a seating situation. Did you reassign a first-class passenger named Daniel Cooper?" There was a brief, static-laden pause before Laura's voice came through, a touch of annoyance bleeding into her carefully crafted professionalism. "Yes, Captain. His ticket didn't match first-class status, so I moved him to economy." She hesitated, the echo of her words hanging in the silence. Is there a problem? Grant's knuckles tightened around the phone. Did you verify his ticket? Check it against the system? Her exhale was audible, a mix of impatience and disbelief. Captain, I've been doing this job for years. I know when someone doesn't belong in first class. His ticket must have been a mistake, or a courtesy upgrade gone wrong. Her confidence, so solid before, began to sound brittle, as if a single push might shatter it. Laura, Grant's voice lost its softness, each word precise. Daniel Cooper is the owner of this airline. Silence. A heavy, suffocating kind. On the screen, he saw her freeze mid-stride, a drink tray balanced on her palm. The color drained from her face, her lips parting as if to form words that refused to come. Around her, the first-class passengers continued their comfortable, cocooned existence, unaware that the ground had just dropped out beneath her. The realization was not just a mistake, it was a free fall, and she had no parachute. Laura's feet felt leaden as she moved through the aisle. The polished, confident steps she had taken earlier were now hesitant, her posture more rigid with every row she passed. The cheerful hum of the cabin seemed to fade, replaced by the pounding of her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. Passengers who had previously dismissed the earlier confrontation now sensed the shift in the air. Eyes followed her, curiosity giving way to something sharper. Judgment, perhaps, or maybe just the instinctive awareness that they were witnessing the unraveling of someone's world. She reached the economy section, her gaze finally settling on Daniel. He sat quietly, his expression calm, a subtle contrast to the storm she felt brewing inside. The mother he had helped earlier looked up, her expression shifting from confusion to understanding. A child a few rows back watched her with wide eyes, sensing the gravity of the moment without needing an explanation. Mr. Cooper, Laura's voice came out thinner than she intended. There's been a misunderstanding. Please allow me to escort you back to your seat in first class. Her words hung in the air, fragile and exposed. Daniel didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch, his calm gaze steady on her. When he finally moved, it was with the same quiet dignity he had shown all along. As he stood, the space around them seemed to hold its breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone within earshot. For anyone who has ever been judged unfairly, this moment might feel all too familiar. That sting of being seen only through the narrow lens of someone else's bias, whether because of appearance, background, or circumstance, is a universal wound. And for those who have made the mistake of passing judgment too quickly, it is a reminder of how small actions can cast long shadows. If you've ever found yourself on either side of this story, your experience matters. Share your story in the comments, not just as a confession or a venting of pain, but as a way to build understanding. Because in stories like this, real or fictional, there is always an opportunity for connection and change. Sometimes, hearing someone else's story is all it takes to change the way we see the world. As Daniel walked back to first class, his steps were unhurried, each one a quiet testament to the strength of patience. He slid into his original seat, buckled his seatbelt, and calmly accepted the glass of water Laura handed him with trembling fingers. The hum of the plane filled the silence, but beneath it lay a palpable shift, a rebalancing of power that everyone felt, even if they didn't fully understand it yet. A soft chime sounded overhead, and Captain Grant's voice filled the cabin, smooth but edged with intent. Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge a very special passenger on board. Mr. Daniel Cooper, the owner of our airline, is traveling with us today. On behalf of our crew, we thank him for his support and for all he has done to ensure every passenger feels valued and respected. The announcement washed over the cabin, a wave of realization crashing into every row. The businessman who had barely looked up from his newspaper earlier sat up straighter, his face a mask of sudden concern. The young woman with earbuds pulled them out completely, her cheeks tinged pink as if a secret had been whispered directly to her. The couple who had exchanged quiet, knowing glances when Daniel was moved to economy now wore expressions of uncomfortable acknowledgement. Their curiosity had been replaced by the weight of respect, a recognition that they had witnessed not just an error, but a profound injustice. For Daniel, this wasn't about revealing his status, it was about the truth finding its way to the surface. As he sat quietly, the cabin around him transformed. The passengers who had once looked through him now saw him clearly. The mother he had helped earlier mouthed a silent thank you, her gratitude now laced with admiration. The child in the back, still watching, saw not just a man returning to his seat, but the quiet triumph of someone who had stood up without needing to fight. Flashes of Daniel's past unfolded like a silent film in his mind. He remembered the school halls where he had once been just Mr. Cooper, the teacher who stayed late to tutor struggling students, who had organized bake sales and driven the old squeaky school bus on field trips. He thought of the nights spent building his consulting business, writing grant proposals by lamplight, the quiet support of his wife, who had believed in his dreams when they were still just seeds in the dark. When the opportunity to invest in a fledgling airline came, Daniel saw more than a business venture. He saw a chance to build something that embodied his values: fairness, respect, and dignity for all. He had insisted on diversity in hiring, on policies that supported inclusivity, on training programs designed to prevent the very situation he now found himself in. And yet, here he was, living proof that change was a journey, not a destination. Around him, first-class passengers who had been wrapped in their own bubbles now felt the prick of awareness. Their discomfort was more than just the awkwardness of witnessing a public mistake. It was the slow, dawning understanding that they had been part of it. They had watched a man be dismissed, and their silence had been its own form of complicity. Daniel didn't need to say a word. His quiet presence in that first-class seat was a reminder that real power didn't need to shout. It only needed to be true. Laura stood near the galley, her back pressed against the cold metal counter. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into the edge, the sharp pain a small anchor in a world suddenly spinning out of control. Her breath came in short, shallow pulls, every exhale a silent curse to herself. How had she misjudged this so completely? Her mind raced back to every step of the interaction with Daniel, her dismissive tone, the way she hadn't bothered to verify his ticket, the automatic assumption that he didn't belong. The realization hit her like ice water. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a prejudice she had never fully confronted. She had prided herself on her professionalism, on treating all passengers with courtesy, but now those beliefs felt hollow, as if they had been nothing more than a thin veneer over something darker. She saw herself through the eyes of the passengers, felt the weight of their judgment. She wasn't just the flight attendant who made a mistake. She was the person who had humiliated a man, not because of what he had done, but because of who she thought he was. Her fear crept in slowly, a cold hand at the back of her neck. She had been with the airline for over a decade, building a career on a foundation of control and authority. But that foundation was crumbling, and she had no idea how to stop it. Her mind spiraled, envisioning disciplinary hearings, whispered conversations in sterile corporate offices, the look of disappointment on her supervisor's face. She had seen other attendants fall from grace, quiet transfers to lesser routes, some disappearing from the company altogether. And now, it was her turn to face the consequences. Captain Grant's voice broke through the fog in her mind. He approached with a steady, unyielding presence, his expression as calm as ever. "Laura," he said, his voice neither harsh nor forgiving, "we'll handle this properly. I need you to remain professional and ensure the rest of the flight goes smoothly." There was no anger in his tone, only the cool efficiency of a man who had seen crises before. He was the rock in the storm, ensuring that no matter the turbulence within the cabin, the plane itself would stay on course. His leadership was a stark contrast to Laura's unraveling, a quiet demonstration of how true authority meant not just holding power, but wielding it with fairness. She nodded, swallowing hard, the taste of her own regret bitter and unshakable. Daniel sat quietly in his first-class seat. his outward calm a reflection of a life spent navigating rough waters with steady hands. While others might see his silence as passivity, those who truly knew him understood it as a deliberate choice. Daniel Cooper had built his life and his business on the foundation of quiet but unwavering principles. His journey from a high school history teacher to the owner of a leading airline wasn't marked by sharp elbows or loud proclamations, but by thoughtful action and unyielding integrity. When he had first become involved with the airline, it wasn't just for the business opportunity. Daniel had seen the chance to create an organization that stood as a model of equity and respect. Under his leadership, the airline had implemented robust anti-discrimination policies. Employees received regular training on unconscious bias, and every member of the staff was encouraged to uphold a culture where every passenger was treated with dignity. His focus wasn't on punishment, but on education, turning mistakes into learning opportunities, encouraging growth, and fostering a workplace where fairness wasn't just an ideal but a daily practice. He had personally funded scholarships for underrepresented students in aviation programs, believing that the industry needed more diverse voices. He pushed for initiatives that ensured hiring practices were inclusive and advocated for transparency at every level of the company. His influence was often felt, not seen, a guiding hand rather than a spotlight. And now, in this small moment on a flight that should have been routine, all those years of quiet advocacy were being put to the test. As the plane settled into a steady cruise, the mother Daniel had helped earlier caught his eye. She offered a small nod, her expression a mix of gratitude and admiration. It was a brief moment, but it spoke volumes. Her gesture was a quiet acknowledgement, not just of his earlier kindness, but of the larger truth that had unfolded before them all. Her nod was more than just a thank you. It was a ripple, a sign that kindness, when practiced genuinely, could resonate long after the moment had passed. For anyone watching, this story might feel familiar. Maybe you've been in Daniel's shoes, judged not by your actions but by someone's narrow perception. Or perhaps you've had a moment like Laura's, where a quick judgment turned into a lasting regret. These are not just stories on an airplane, they are reflections of everyday life, where the smallest decisions can create the biggest impacts. Daniel's quiet patience, his strength in stillness, is a reminder that humility is not weakness. And Laura's journey, painful as it is, shows us how easy it is to let our biases guide us if we're not careful. In a world often too quick to judge, perhaps the most powerful thing we can do is pause, look closer, and choose to see the person before us for who they truly are. As the plane began its descent, Laura's pulse quickened. The reality of the situation settled over her like a heavy, unshakable fog. She had managed to maintain a professional facade through the remainder of the flight, but beneath her steady hands and practiced smile, her thoughts raced. She replayed every misstep, every word she had spoken to Daniel, each moment now a glaring sign of her failure. Her earlier confidence had crumbled into a raw, gnawing fear. When the plane taxied to the gate, Laura unbuckled her seatbelt with fingers that trembled. Passengers rose, stretching and retrieving their bags, but Laura stayed frozen in place. She knew something awaited her beyond the cabin door, something she could not avoid. She forced herself to breathe evenly, each inhale a desperate grasp for composure. As the doors opened, a figure in a tailored gray suit stood just beyond the threshold. His expression was unreadable, but the weight of his presence spoke volumes. Behind him, two uniformed security officers waited, their stances neutral yet unmistakably firm. The executive stepped forward, his voice polite but devoid of warmth. "Miss Bennett, I need you to come with us." The air around her seemed to thin. Passengers, still disembarking, watched with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. Laura moved mechanically, her feet following the executive's lead through the jet bridge, the security officers keeping a respectful but undeniable distance. She felt the judgment in every glance, the whispers that followed in her wake. Her authority, once so solid, had vanished, leaving her adrift in the sea of consequences she had created. Laura sat at the end of a long conference table, her back straight, hands clasped tightly in her lap. The small, sterile room felt as though it were closing in on her, each breath pressing against walls that seemed to inch closer with every second. Across from her sat 3 executives, their expressions carefully neutral. They had introduced themselves briefly, and now the only sound was the soft shuffle of papers as they reviewed the file in front of them. Her file. One of the executives, a woman with silver-streaked hair and a gaze as sharp as glass, finally spoke. "Miss Bennett, do you understand why you're here today?" Her voice was calm, but it held the weight of finality. Laura swallowed, her throat dry. "Yes," she managed, her voice strained. "There was a misunderstanding with a passenger's seating." The man to the woman's right, his jaw tight and expression stern, leaned forward. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, his tone making it clear the term was not sufficient. "According to our reports, you failed to verify a first-class ticket, made an unfounded assumption about a passenger, and subsequently displaced the owner of this airline." Each word struck like a blow. Laura's carefully rehearsed defenses crumbled under the cold truth of the executive's summary. The third member of the panel, a quiet man who had yet to speak, finally looked up. His voice was softer, but carried a weight that the others lacked. "This isn't just about a seating mistake, Miss Bennett. It's about the standards we expect from those in leadership positions within our organization. Your actions not only undermined our policies, but also showcased a judgment that we cannot align with our company's values." A paper slid across the table, her name at the top, bold and final. "Effective immediately, your employment with this airline is terminated." Laura stared at the document, the reality of the words swimming before her eyes. The hands that had held so many tickets, served so many drinks, now lay limp on the table. Her career, built on years of service and discipline, was over in a matter of minutes. She had often been the one enforcing the rules, but now, stripped of her uniform and authority, she was the one facing the harsh, unyielding truth. She stood, her body moving as if detached from her mind, and allowed herself to be guided to the door. For the first time in her life, Laura Bennett had no clear direction, only the cold certainty that this chapter of her life had closed for good. As the plane's doors opened and the first-class passengers began to disembark, Daniel Cooper stood, gathered his belongings, and moved with the same quiet grace he had maintained throughout the flight. His expression remained calm, his pace unhurried. There was no trace of vindication in his demeanor, no need to gloat or draw attention to the shift in power that had unfolded. His strength lay in the silence between his steps, in the way he held himself with quiet dignity, allowing actions to speak louder than words ever could. He moved through the aisle, offering a gentle nod to the flight attendants who now stood with a newfound respect etched into their faces. His path led him past rows of passengers who had witnessed the entire story. Those who had watched from the comfort of their privileged seats now looked at him with a blend of admiration and quiet introspection. Daniel had not demanded respect. He had earned it through patience and integrity. Near the exit, the young mother he had helped earlier sat with her child still sleeping on her shoulder. She reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against his arm. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but filled with meaning. "Thank you," she said, the words heavy with gratitude, not just for the small kindness he had shown her, but for the larger truth he had revealed to everyone on that plane. Around them, others who had remained silent during the confrontation now offered small gestures of acknowledgement, a nod, a warm smile, a look that lingered a moment longer than necessary. It was as if Daniel's quiet strength had not only restored balance, but had also served as a mirror, reflecting back at everyone the power of humility and the danger of quick judgments. Each step he took off the plane was a reminder that real power needed no announcement. It simply was, steady and unwavering, long after the moment had passed. Laura sat in the small, sterile room just beyond the gate, the termination letter still clutched tightly in her trembling hands. The words on the page seemed to blur, each sentence a stark reminder that the life she had built, The career she had cherished was over. The magnitude of her mistake weighed down on her, each breath a reminder that this wasn't a bad dream, but a reality from which she couldn't wake up. Her mind raced, replaying every interaction, every moment where her confidence had veiled the prejudice lurking beneath. She realized now that this wasn't just a misstep, it was a fundamental failure of character, and the consequences would follow her far beyond the walls of this airport. When Daniel reached the exit, Laura was still standing to the side, her back against the wall, eyes downcast. As he passed by, he slowed, his movements deliberate. He didn't look at her with anger or disdain, just a quiet, steady gaze that held no malice. He leaned in slightly, his voice low but clear. "Next time, check the person before you check the ticket." The words were simple, almost gentle, but they struck with the force of undeniable truth. Then he moved on, his footsteps steady, leaving her alone with the weight of what she had lost. The contrast between their departures was stark. Daniel moved through the airport with a quiet dignity, his presence both humble and powerful. Those who recognized him offered soft nods and respectful glances, the kind reserved for someone who had shown grace under pressure. Meanwhile, Laura's walk through the terminal was a different story. Her head hung low, shoulders slumped under the burden of shame. She felt every look, every whisper, each one a needle piercing the fragile fabric of her composure. What had once been her domain, a place where she wielded authority, had become an unfamiliar landscape, one where she no longer belonged. As she reached the doors leading outside, the cool air hit her face, and for the first time, she understood what it meant to be on the other side of judgment, to feel the sting of being unseen and unvalued. As the doors of the airport closed behind Laura, the story of what had unfolded on that flight lingered in the air. It wasn't just about a seating mistake or a personnel decision. It was a mirror reflecting the quiet biases and judgments that often shape our interactions. The passengers on that flight had witnessed a lesson in humility and the profound difference. This story leaves us with a powerful question. How often do we judge others based on what we see, instead of who they truly are? It's a question worth sitting with, allowing it to settle into the corners of our minds. In a world where first impressions often dictate our responses, it's easy to fall into the trap of letting appearances guide us. But as this story shows, the truth of a person lies far deeper than the surface. If this story moved you, if it brought up memories or made you think twice, consider sharing it, not to spread a tale of downfall, but to share a message of understanding and respect. Each of us holds the power to influence those around us, not just through grand gestures, but through small, everyday choices, to look beyond the surface and see the person standing in front of us. Sometimes, sharing a story like this can be the spark that prompts someone else to pause and reflect. At its core, this story is a reminder that dignity and respect are not privileges reserved for a select few. They are the baseline of how we should treat every human being. The quiet patience that Daniel showed, the calm in his response, speaks to the strength found in stillness. It shows us that standing up for ourselves doesn't always mean raising our voices. Sometimes, it means letting the truth reveal itself in its own time. Have you ever been in a situation like this, where judgment was cast too quickly, or where a quiet truth turned the story around? How did you handle it? What did you learn? Sharing your experience in the comments isn't just about adding to the conversation. It's about building a bridge of empathy and understanding. Your story might be the one that helps someone else see things from a new perspective. By sharing, commenting, and engaging with stories like this, you're not just interacting with content. You're contributing to a culture where empathy is valued over prejudice, where understanding is chosen over assumption. It is through these small acts that we create a world where everyone feels seen and valued for who they truly are. In the end, the story of Daniel and Laura is more than a tale of a mistake and its consequences. It is a call to each of us to examine the ways we look at those around us, to ask ourselves if we are building connections or drawing lines, offering grace or making judgments. It challenges us to take a step back, and let the truth of each person speak for itself. And perhaps, if enough of us take that step, the world will become a little more just, a little more kind, and a lot more human.